We have the extreme pleasure this segment of being joined by former U.S. Permanent Representative of the United Nations, John Bolton. He was also Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, and he currently is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
Well, we have a monumental deal in front of us that has been sold to the public as a way to stop the Iranian government from its goal of a nuclear weapon. Have the Iranians changed their mind? Is this actually a change in policy, or are we being sold a bill of goods?
Well, I think we're being sold a bill of goods by the president. I've compared this to an American diplomatic Waterloo. The Iranians have achieved every one of their most important objectives, particularly unfreezing tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions of assets, and getting relief from economic sanctions. And in return, they've given up only the most trivial, easily reversible concessions on their nuclear program. The fact is that there's simply no evidence, certainly the Obama administration has not produced any, that indicates Iran has really made a strategic decision to reverse 30-plus years of policy where they've been seeking nuclear weapons. I think Iran is nearly certain to violate this deal based on their past performance, probably already is violating the deal. We don't have adequate measures to detect these violations, and the agreement's so-called enforcement mechanisms really, I think, will become objects of derision in the very near future.
Folks, we're talking here on Secure Freedom Radio with former Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. You seem particularly skeptical of the idea that the Iranians will comply, and I think that's justified. If they did comply with the deal, the best we get is 8 to 10 years of relief, at which point they are pretty much unfettered in their path to develop a weapon. What then should we do? Now, you've made some fairly muscular calls, as you are wont to do, about what we could actually do. Is there a path to militarily at least slow down their program enough to make it worth that fairly significant risk?
Well, here's the choice that we face, and we faced it for quite some time. I'd say at least 7 or 8 years. And the choice is between a nuclear Iran on the one hand and all of the consequences that means in the Middle East and around the world, or using military force to stop it. The president has, as usual, posited a false choice. This deal is not going to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And if the deal collapsed and Iran went on its way, it would still get nuclear weapons. It's a very unpleasant choice to have to talk about military force. Israel has had to answer that question twice before in its history, and it, in both cases, has struck nuclear weapons programs in the hands of hostile states, Iraq in 1981 and Syria in 2007. And that's really the choice we face. Now, this is not being belligerent. After all, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, has said repeatedly, all options are on the table, which is a code phrase for the use of military force. The problem is nobody believes the president. The Iranians don't believe him. The Israelis don't believe him. I don't believe him. So it's pretty clear that during the remainder of his presidency, no matter how many times he says all options are on the table, there is zero chance that the U.S. will use military force against Iran. That's why the spotlight's on Israel. If you don't like Iran's behavior today, imagine what it will be like once they get nuclear weapons. And the alternatives that many people talk about, bringing sanctions back into effect, reviving the ones we have and adding to them, is delusional. The Europeans are lined up for very lucrative trade and investment agreements. The pressure on the European governments to make this happen is overwhelming. And as I paraphrase Bruce Springsteen in an op-ed on Sunday, these sanctions are going, boys, and they ain't coming back.
Well, if the boss says it, it's got to be true. Now, it seems President Obama has put some roadblocks in the path of Israel taking any military action previously. And from a lot of folks' understanding of the deal as it's currently laid on the table, it seems like we're required, the United States is required, to bodyguard Iran's nuclear program. Is that another attempt to put a perhaps physical or human shield factor into stopping Israel from taking action?
Well, I think that what we've committed, at least as I read the document, is to provide the kind of security to Iran against terrorists stealing their nuclear technology or in some sense learning from them. And we've discussed similar kinds of protections with others, including the former Soviet Union under the Nunn-Lugar program. I think that's bad enough. After all, Iran is the world's central banker for international terrorism, and the notion we're protecting their nuclear program against other terrorists is ludicrous on its face. But I don't think this necessarily, as I read the language, requires us to defend Iran against a potential Israeli attack. But I will say this as well. This is a lengthy, complicated document. I've read through it and parts of it several times. I need to read through it again about 3 or 4 more times before I will feel comfortable that I totally understand it. And beyond that, I think it is absolutely essential that Congress, in its 60-day review process, stand up on its hind legs and say, we want every side deal, every codicil, every understanding, every wink and nod, whether they're written down or not, anything in any way related to this deal that the president has committed to. Because it may well be that there are verbal understandings, written side deals. Who knows what there is in addition to the ones that are already mentioned in the deal itself between Iran and the International Atomic Energy Agency. I'm just worried that the 4 corners of the deal itself don't contain all the critical provisions. And I just think Congress and its committees have to insist on this, no compromise on it. They need to see it. I think the American people should see them too.
That would be a breath of fresh air. And the Senate performing its constitutional duty to advise and consent, as you mentioned, would be helpful just to illuminate all of the side deals and the other things you mentioned. One thing that has been brought up recently was the possibility that this deal may violate the provisions of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, that is an actual treaty. That is a legitimate piece of legislation with the treaty with the force of a federal statute. Is there a possibility that this executive action, which Obama purposely avoided making a treaty, may in some way, shape, or form run afoul of the actual signed treaty, the NPT?
Well, I think Iran's conduct for the last 30 years has been in violation of the NPT. So that would simply, the agreement is, that would simply be a pimple on the body politic of what Iran is already doing. I mean, fundamentally, there's been a lot written. I'm sure there'll be more written about this legality and that legality. And just speaking as a lawyer, none of this has to do with law. This is about power. Iran's got it, and it's going to get more when it gets nuclear weapons. And we're standing back and doing nothing. Or waiting for Israel to do the job for us. That's the reality. And until we address that, until we recognize that we are allowing Iran to become a nuclear weapons state, threatening the region and the world, and it doesn't stop with Iran. Other countries in the region have seen the course we're on. We're already in the opening stages of a nuclear arms race. Saudi Arabia looking to get nuclear weapons, Egypt, Turkey, perhaps others. So then in a relatively short period of time, as these things go, 5 or 10 years, you could see 6 nuclear weapon states in the Middle East. That's what the president is allowing to happen.
Well, that would be a disgrace, and for a man who came to power with an avowed goal of ridding the world of nuclear weapons, I think one of his legacies may well be, as you just mentioned, proliferating them across one of the most volatile regions in the world. Thank you very much, Ambassador. We've been talking with John Bolton, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, about the dangers posed by President Obama's Iran deal.